and guest lecturer to Invent program. I'm Pralita Ainuzahra, and I will be emceeing for today's class. It's an honor for me to welcome our key speaker, Professor Paolo Barberi, from Institute of Life Science, SSSA, Pisa, Italy, to speak more about functional agrobiodiversity and agroecological weed management. And ladies and gentlemen, as the opening of the meeting, it will be great if we can hear an opening remarks from our Secretary of Agronomy Department. So please join me to welcome Dr. Afifuddin Latif Adirejo, SP MSc.
Okay, thank you. Wait, please. I think the connection unstable here. Check. It's okay now?
Quite clear.
Yes?
It's quite clear, Pak. It's quite clear.
Okay, quite clear. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully, all of you are doing well. First of all, on behalf of the head of Department of Agronomy, Dr. Nur Rahmi, I would like to welcome everyone that come on this Zoom meeting in the occasion of 3-in-1 lectures. I think this is the fourth for 3-in-1 lecture of plant production technology. And it is a great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer. Hello, good afternoon from here, Professor Paolo Barberi.
Thank you.
Thank
good
you
afternoon
in advance for your time and your availability. I hope and I really expect the student could discuss with you and in this special guest lecture. I'm going to express the appreciation to my colleague. First, the head of crop and environmental laboratory, Dr. Sitawati, all of the official committee, and all of lecturer, as well as professor from crop and environmental laboratory, and others maybe who come here that participate in the seminar of lecture. The secondly, that I would like to give special message to our students. By pursuing this lecture, I insist you to learn seriously. I hope and please pay much attention to the explanation of Professor Paolo Barberi. You should ask some scientific information that may be or possibly not too clear and not to be discussed further. Please enjoy for these special occasions, and once again for my colleagues in Crop and Environmental Laboratory, good luck for your fourth series 3-in-1 lectures, and finally have a nice lecture and seminar. Good day for all of you, and thank you for your attentions. I give back to Master of Ceremony. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Afif. Now I would like to move on to the housekeeping rules to make sure that we have an enjoyable session and a meeting discussion. So Bapak Ibu, and for those of you participants, let me remind you to fill the attendance form that's already available in this panel. And you can also write down your own question in the Q&A box in the Zoom. And make sure to read the existing question first before you write down your own, just in case it has a similarity with yours. So you can just forward it by clicking the thumbs up icon. And now we actually have a fun agenda here. I will invite all of you to take a photo session. For participants, please turn on the camera so we can take picture together. I will get you ready. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. One more. 1, 2, 3, smile. And freestyle. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And next is we have speech from our. I think we are going to start the discussion today, but before that, I'm going to invite our great moderator, Bapak Kurniawan Puji Wicaksana, SP MP PhD. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you. Just checking, is my voice is clear enough
Yes, it's already clear.
or not?
Beautiful sounds.
Okay. Okay. First of all, I would like to check. Okay. Just to give you a hint about Professor Paulo Barberi. Well, not too long ago, agriculture is just agronomy, protection, and soil science. But since Professor Barberi and his gang join in, now we can enjoy agriculture with more ecologically sound. So in the short way, he's one of the father of functional ecology, of functional agrobiodiversity, and agrobiodiversity, which is for us is a good hope that someday agriculture would be more sustainable, more ecologically sound, and less harmful to the environment. So without any more introductions, I believe that we can start to enjoy Professor Barberi presentations and lectures on the title of Functional Agrobiodiversity and Agroecological Weed Management. And also special thanks to Dr. Uma for arranging these programs, and also special thanks to the committees who are willing to arrange this 3-in-1 program. To Professor Barberi, I think I'll give all the times to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sonny, and thanks to everyone for this very generous introduction. And I'm very happy to be here with you again after a year or so. I'm going to share my screen for the first presentation, and which would probably last 20-25 minutes or so. And then you can fire all your questions that you like to ask. And I don't know if Sonny, you will be collecting and selecting the questions, or shall I do it myself?
Yes, I'll do it for you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you for your support. So, right, please tell me if you're able to see my presentation. Can you see it? Not yet?
Yes, already.
It's very clear.
Okay, good. So, what I'm first going to tell you is basically an introduction, short introduction to a very important concept, in my opinion, for sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture and agroecology are very much based on understanding and using in a wise way what we call agrobiodiversity. We will see what we mean by agrobiodiversity. We will see that there are many ways of classifying and interpreting agrobiodiversity, and a good combination of all these elements could really drive agricultural system towards sustainability. So that's pretty much the content of my first lecture or seminar. So I will start with making a comparison between the general concept of biodiversity and the more specific concept of agrobiodiversity, which is a part of it. And we will see that agrobiodiversity has been defined very clearly by the CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an important set of activities established by the United Nations back in 1992. And after that, a series of more detailed definitions of the different components of agrobiodiversity was coined. And these include, for example, the distinction between plant and associated agrobiodiversity. Both of them can be important for agricultural sustainability. And it is important to understand what they are, how they can be implemented, and what are the type of interactions that can occur in cropping and farming system when we try to implement agrobiodiversity. And then I will more specifically focus to another subpart of biodiversity, which is probably the most important in trying to make agriculture more sustainable. And this is what we call functional agrobiodiversity. And by functional agrobiodiversity, I can anticipate, we refer to that part of agrobiodiversity which is related to the provision of ecosystem services. So this is a term that you might be familiar with. So people are talking more and more about ecosystem services also in the context of agriculture, and not just in the context of, you know, general ecosystems or habitats. And it is important to understand what is the relationship between biodiversity and agrobiodiversity in the case of agroecosystems and the provision of agroecosystem services. This is important because in this way we can capture at best the potential, the huge potential that agrobiodiversity has to improve agricultural systems in the direction of sustainability. And I will then briefly give some working definition and examples, but I will mainly focus on a four-step approach to the study and the implementation of functional agrobiodiversity that we have developed and published. And if anyone is interested in further exploring this concept, I can share a chapter of the book that we have wrote specifically on this topic. So when we talk about biodiversity, well, everybody is talking about biodiversity, but as a matter of fact, the concept of biodiversity is quite recent. And here, in this picture, you see here is an aerial view of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where in 1992, there was an important conference summoned by the United Nations. It was called the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, that included the participation of delegates from basically every country in the world. And one of the most important outcomes out of this conference, which then became famous as Rio 1992, was the promulgation of an important convention from the United Nations, specifically on biological diversity, the so-called CBD, which stands for Convention on Biological Diversity. Here, if you wish, you can have later have a look at the official website of the CBD. But what is the CBD? It's basically a huge endeavor by basically the vast majority of states in the world to understand, conserve, protect, and use in a sustainable way every type of biodiversity that can occur on our planet. So we are referring to earth biodiversity, to marine biodiversity, biodiversity that you can find in every type of habitats in the world. And why is that? That is because biodiversity is at the very heart of our own lives. So without biodiversity in our planet, we could not survive. We could not adapt to changes. And right now, we are among two very important changes. One is climate change that is affecting every one of us. And that, as you know, is largely a cause of inappropriate economic management, not just on agriculture, but in general. And the second big change that we are all facing is the pandemic. The pandemic, it has also quite a lot to do with biodiversity, and specifically with biodiversity loss and habitat destruction. And as you know, the most accredited hypothesis about the origin of the pandemics is that there has been a spillover between from one species to the human species through an intermediate host, and this has occurred because of habitat destruction that facilitated the contact between the virus and eventually humans. So the pandemics has a lot to do with biodiversity and biodiversity loss, and I think one of the most important messages that goes beyond the issue of agriculture is that everyone should care about biodiversity for our own sake. And biodiversity is so pervasive in our own lives and for our economies that it is very much important to really understand the role that it can play for our own well-being. So that was basically when the recent story of biodiversity and the term itself started, less than 30 years ago. And biodiversity, as defined by just the CBD, is the biological diversity. Basically, biodiversity is the short version of biological diversity. The variability among all living organisms from all different sources. So, as I said before, they include terrestrial, marine, aquatic ecosystems, and it's not just a list of species or other categories to group organisms in all these different habitats. Is the interplay between those organisms and the ecosystems in which they live that really makes the distinctive feature of biodiversity. And the CBD defines 3 levels of biodiversity, which are also present when we talk specifically about agrobiodiversity. The within species level, also called genetic diversity, so it's the genetic variation within a single species of plant, animal, microorganism, whatever. A second level, the diversity between species, also called species diversity, and this is referring to the different communities of plants, animals, etc., that are present in a given ecosystem at a given time. And of course, the dynamics of the species across time and space. And a third level, which is called ecosystem or habitat diversity. Here we are upscaling and we are referring to the overall diversity of the whole set of ecosystems and habitats that we can identify everywhere on our planet. And this type of diversity also includes structural elements of these habitats, so how they are composed on top of the composition of these habitats. And in terms of agriculture, this means, for example, what is the type of agricultural land use, which type of crops we are cultivating in a given landscape, and whether or not there are habitats connecting the different crops, and the state of these habitats as well. So basically, as you see, biodiversity includes everything. So from the very small to the very large scale of either organisms and habitats. But why we care about biodiversity? And I think that there is no better way of explaining why biodiversity is so important for all of us than referring to this kind of wheel, the so-called wheel of ecosystem services, which is one of the major and most famous outcome of a very broad study, which was conducted about 20 years ago, and that ended in 2005. And this study was called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So it involved more than 1,300 experts and scientists from all over the world and very many disciplines that they got together to make the point, make the state of biodiversity and of the ecosystem services that are associated to biodiversity. And one of the most striking evidence coming out of this exercise was the classification of ecosystem services in 4 different categories. So we have provisioning services, which means all what we get as humans from biodiversity and that we exploit in various forms, starting from food. So food is the first obvious example of biodiversity that we are selecting for our scopes of feeding ourselves. But we can have very many other type of provisions from biodiversity, raw materials for constructions, for other type of uses for clothing and so on. Medicines, as you know, the most important source of new drugs is nature. So plants, microorganisms, mainly those 2 big taxa, are the source of important medicines. And if we are destroying biodiversity, we are also destroying the potential that we have to cure ourselves in the future. Because finding out new sources of drugs is very much important for adapting to new diseases and new physiological disorders that can affect ourselves as humans, but also other animals, and in general, the environment. Fresh water, another very important provision that biodiversity can offer us. So this is probably the most obvious type of services that can generate from biodiversity, but there are others which are not less important. For example, we have these 2 categories, regulating and supporting services, which are quite interconnected with one another, and they refer, for example, in agriculture, to the support that soil, a healthy soil, can give to agricultural production. So soil formation is one of the 3 recognized supporting services, just like photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the basis, as you know, of the production of biomass from plants. And that's why it supports a series of other interconnected things. And nutrient cycling, another very important supporting service for agriculture. Without an efficient nutrient cycling, and this is something at the heart of the agroecological and sustainable approach to agriculture, we couldn't have a sustainable production for our crops. And then about the regulating services, we have many that are also relevant for agriculture. Climate regulation, regulation of water quantity, but also quality, erosion regulation. So we have to stop landslides and in general soil erosion on our agricultural land. Otherwise, we're losing the most fertile part of our land, and we are jeopardizing our future in terms of the possibility of feeding ourselves. Pollination, 70% of crops in the world are more or less dependent on pollinators. And you know that bees and other type of pollinators are at serious risk of disappearing. And some of them are already at the brink of extinction. So if we are losing those species and that service, it will be a tremendous problem for agriculture and for feeding ourselves, and so on and so forth. And then there is a 4th and less known, but not less important, in my opinion, group of ecosystem services, the so-called cultural services. And these are basically a way to represent the diversity of points of view in which different people in different areas of the world value biodiversity. You could value biodiversity just for aesthetic reason, a nice landscape with lots of nature and maybe a combination of agriculture and natural habitats. That will be a pleasure for the eyes of people. And I mean, you don't have to consider that this is a minor thing, because it's those type of things that often give us the motivation to conserve and protect biodiversity, rather than other more, let's say, pragmatic type of services. Recreation. People living in cities like to go out in nature, including agricultural land. And that's another important cultural service. We usually feel better when we are amid nature. And this psychological effect of biodiversity should not be neglected, because I mean, the quality of our own lives, it also depends on this type of feeling and this type of appreciation. And then there are spiritual and religious values. There are some natural habitats which are valued as important religious sites from local people. And again, this is part of our heritage, and we should value the importance of these services as well. Clearly, valuing or quantifying the so-called cultural services is not as easy as quantifying the production of food or the rate of photosynthesis or the rate of soil erosion. So this is what is making this fourth category a little more fuzzy. But this doesn't mean that we should downplay the importance of this component as well. And in the end, it's the combination of all these four categories of services which really let us appreciate the importance as well as the beauty of biodiversity. So we are working in agriculture. So the part of biodiversity we are mostly interested in is what we call agrobiodiversity. And if we want to provide a definition of agrobiodiversity, we could say, just reprising the general definition of biodiversity, that agrobiodiversity is the variability of the animals, the plants, and the microorganisms that are directly or indirectly utilized for agriculture and food production. So for food production, feed production, and the other type of provisioning service that we can associate with agroecosystem. So they include crops, livestock, trees, but also fishery. And more specifically, at the genetic level, they refer to the diversity of genetic resources, like, for example, the varieties of plants and the breeds of animals, and of the species, the different crops, the different species of animals that we can use as livestock, that we generally utilize for the production of food, fiber, forage, etc., etc. But there is another component of agrobiodiversity which is not less important, and that is the diversity of those natural species, like, for example, soil microorganisms or predators or pollinators that support production, either directly or indirectly. And then we have the other type of organisms that maybe don't have a clear role in supporting production, but they are there. And so they are a vital part, an important, integral part of agrobiodiversity, and they interact with the type of organisms that are more important for agricultural production. So we should not neglect the importance of those organisms too. And this leads us directly to the definition of two different types of agrobiodiversity. So we can have the so-called plant agrobiodiversity. What we mean by plant agrobiodiversity is the type of agrobiodiversity at any level, at the genetic level, at the species level, and at the habitat level, that we deliberately introduce and use to improve our agroecosystem. So if we are a farmer or a land manager, we organize our production system in such a way to compose, pick up elements of agrobiodiversity at the genetic level, at the species level and habitat level, and the combination of all these elements make up our production system. Some examples. Varieties of crops or breeds of animals are examples of plant agrobiodiversity at the genetic level. So we choose which varieties of a given crop or which breeds of a given animal species we want to use. At the species level of agrobiodiversity, we can identify the different type of crops or cover crops that we are using, and the different type of animal species, if we have more than one, that are present on a farm. At the habitat level, agrobiodiversity can be identified, for example, as the hedgerows or other type of field margins that we are planting or managing in various ways. Just because we are introducing these elements of the landscape in our agroecosystem, they belong to what we call plant agrobiodiversity. And this allows us to make a distinction with the other type of agrobiodiversity that we call associated agrobiodiversity. What do we mean by associated? We mean all these elements, again, at any of the three levels, genetic, species, and habitat, that are naturally present in agroecosystem and that can influence, but can also be influenced by the different type of agricultural management that a farmer can put in place. There are some examples of associated biodiversity. At the genetic level, we can analyze the diversity, the genetic diversity within populations of wild insects. If we have the wild bees, right? One species of wild bees, we can analyze the genetic structure of this population to see what is the level of diversity. And typically, diversity, genetic diversity, is one important and fundamental component of the possibility for a species to adapt to a changing environment. And as I said before, in a period of climate change, keeping this genetic diversity is the first and foremost important thing to improve the probability of adapting to change. Then we can have wild plant species, including what we call the weeds. So that is an example of associated agrobiodiversity at the species level. But then every natural element in a habitat, like natural woodlands or ponds, or maybe peatland, like those you have in Indonesia, are examples of agrobiodiversity of the associated type. So obviously, as you can understand, through agricultural management, we can facilitate or direct the interactions between the plant and the associated type of agrobiodiversity. And of course, the objective in agriculture is to try to obtain the maximum amount of services out of this interaction. And this is very much the objective of sustainable agriculture. So we have seen that we have potentially a lot of components of agrobiodiversity that we could use, but how much of these components are we actually using nowadays? Here you see a graph which is showing the percentage of the total area in the world. These are FAO data, which have been elaborated out of a recent report. This is basically showing, in terms of surface, what is the share of the most important crop species in the world. And you see that 5 of them, wheat, maize, rice, soybean, and barley, altogether constitute more than 50%, actually 53.2% on 2016 data, of the total agricultural surface, so the total area which is cultivated. So despite the fact that we have several hundreds of crops potentially utilizable in agriculture, we are just concentrating on a few of them. And from a functional point of view, so from the point of view of what type of crops they are, so you can see that the 5 top crops are quite homogeneous, and actually 4 of them are grasses. Wheat, maize, rice, and barley, they are cereals, so they belong to the group of cereals. The only outlier is soybean, which is a legume. So again, there is even less diversity, which is actually exploited than what might seem by just looking at the share of the surface occupied by the different crops. And this is a similar graph, but based on the amount of production in terms of total biomass. And even though the type of the crops in the top 5 are slightly different from the previous case, we can still see quite a strong concentration of the top 5. The top 5 produce 54% of the total biomass related to agricultural production in the whole world. Here we have sugarcane on top, but the main reason for this is that sugarcane, as you probably know, is a crop that is able to produce a huge amount of biomass. And this explains why it is on top of the ranking. So sugarcane alone produces more than 1/5 of the total agricultural biomass of the whole world, which is a huge amount. But then we have maize, wheat, rice, and potato. Potato is in the top 5 because you know, the tubers of potato are quite heavy, so they are able to, it's a crop that is able to produce quite a lot of biomass, and it's widespread all over the world, and this explains this position as the 5th place in the ranking. So either we see the picture from the point of view of total surface, or from the point of view of the total biomass produced in agriculture, we can see that we are just concentrating on a very small amount of crops compared to the crops that we are potentially potentially available. And the same is true if we look at varieties of cultivated crops. This is a classical graph which has been produced some years ago and explains a phenomenon called genetic erosion. By genetic erosion, if we focus on cultivated varieties, we mean the loss of the number of cultivated varieties compared to a previous situation. In this graph, you see 10 different vegetable crops. In the outer part of this graph, you see beet, cabbage, sweet corn, lettuce, muskmelon, and so on. The number and the size of the graph on top of the chart represents the total number of cultivars of each of these 10 vegetable species, which were grown in the United States in 1903, so more than a century ago. And the corresponding number in the lower part of the graph, so we can see this as a kind of tree. So the branches represent the number of cultivars of those species grown a century ago, and the roots of this hypothetical tree represents the number of cultivars of the same species grown 80 years later. And you see that how shrinking is the number of cultivars for all those species. For example, in the case of beet, we went from 288 cultivars to only 17. For cucumber, we had 285 cultivars, and in 1983, we only had 16. And you see how large is the loss of genetic material, so the genetic erosion that has undergone this group of vegetable species. To sum up, there were nearly 3,900 total varieties in 1903 and only 307 in 1983. So this means a loss of more than 92% of the total number of cultivated varieties for those crops. Now, what is the reason for this? There are many reasons, partly economic reason, partly agronomic, or let's say agricultural in general reasons. For example, the difficulty of storing this produce for a type of market which progressively became more and more global. So if a vegetable crop has to travel long distance, it has to withstand the difficulties of this travel. And this partly explains why part of these varieties were actually disappeared. but there might be other reasons for this. So we don't have time to discuss about these. Maybe this could be an issue for discussion later. But what I just want to point out with this graph is that we are putting ourselves at risk by losing such a large amount of germplasm for the reason that I have explained before, because we are losing the possibility to adapt to a changing environment due to climate change, but also due to market change. So consumers might change their preferences. And if you don't have the right type of produce that you can put on the market, then you are in trouble. So that's another perspective that, in my view, explains why we have to worry about genetic erosion. And luckily, some international bodies like Biodiversity International, which is one of the institutes of the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, or TGIAR, which is an organism managed by the United Nations, have felt the problem and have started doing something. So, for example, Biodiversity International, as you can see from this slide, has put up a working group on so-called NUS, which stands for Neglected and Underutilized Species, with the objective of conserving those minor crops, because often those minor crops are very nutritious. They have a lot of interesting benefits from the point of view of human health, but also from a point of view of developing new markets, maybe niche markets, but very profitable, that could make a difference, especially for small-scale farmers that are those who traditionally have cultivated this type of species, and they still are, to some extent, cultivating and using those species. So if we lose those species, we are not losing the species as such, but we are also losing a good deal of heritage and culture that is associated with those species. And this is something that we cannot afford any longer. Now, so I mentioned the three species of agrobiodiversity: within species, between species, and the level of ecosystems, and the importance of the interconnections between these three levels. I want to focus a little bit more on the species level of agrobiodiversity, because this can lead us to the what we call the functional part of agrobiodiversity. So the definition of the CBD, which has been reprised by the OECD, which is the International Organization for Economic Development, in a background paper on agrobiodiversity indicators, classifies species agrobiodiversity into three components. We have species that are supporting agricultural production, like microorganisms in the soil, mycorrhizae, earthworms, and the different species and gills of what we call beneficial arthropods, so pollinators, predators, parasitoids, and so on. We have a second group of species that are wild species, somehow depending either directly or indirectly on agriculture and on the effects, positive or negative, of agriculture. So we have birds, we can have bats, we can have rodents living in agro-ecosystems, but we can also have downstream marine or fluvial species like fish or crustaceans that are affected by, for example, the discharge of agricultural land. And we have to be aware of these type of interactions too. And then there is a third group of species, which are the so-called exotic or invasive species. And here we are referring mainly to the new weeds, the new insect pests, and the new pathogens that we are always experiencing in every type of agricultural system in all over the world. Now, if we see these three categories from the point of view of the services associated to them, we can clearly see a difference between them. The first category clearly has a positive function. So it is associated to a service production that we obviously value. The second category or group of species has a more variable or uncertain type of characteristic from the point of view of the service. Some of them can be positive, some of them can be negative to agriculture without a very clear connotation. While the third group clearly has a negative connotation to agriculture, because we're talking about weeds, pests, and pathogens. So this is just to show that we need to go forward from the general classification of agrobiodiversity to a more functional classification of agrobiodiversity. And if we talk about habitat agrobiodiversity, here again, we can have different categories which are not necessarily so obvious. So we can include into the definition of habitat agrobiodiversity the different type of farming systems, including the way we manage them, but also the relationship between agricultural land use and non-agricultural land use in the landscape. So the relationship between agriculture, urban areas, industrial areas, natural reserves, and so on. Of course, there are interactions between agroecosystems and nearby ecosystems, and we need to take them into account. Now, moving on towards a functional view to biodiversity, we can basically approach the issue from two different and apparently opposite perspectives. So we can manage agriculture in such a way to conserve the biodiversity which is living in an agroecosystem. So if we are using agriculture for biodiversity, that we could call A for B, we are referring to a series of ecosystem services which are not necessarily associated to agricultural production. So if we have rare species of plants or animals that are living in an agroecosystem, we may want to protect those species without necessarily valuing the contribution that those species give to agricultural production. They may not contribute much to production, but they live in an agroecosystem, so we should conserve them. So in this case, we are mainly focusing on conservation values and also cultural services. I mean, if people care about conserving the biodiversity of the wild flora or fauna in an agroecosystem, that's one of what we can call a cultural service. But then we have the other apparently opposite approach, understanding biodiversity in such a way to improve the way we manage agriculture. So B, biodiversity for agriculture. And here we are, as a matter of fact, referring to a series of ecosystem services which are either directly or indirectly relevant for agricultural production, like soil fertility, biological pest control, weed reduction, and so on. Now, the interesting, in my opinion, feature of an agroecological approach to agriculture is that the message is there is not necessarily a contradiction between conserving biodiversity and promoting agricultural production. We can manage our agroecosystem in such a way to have both. So to have good and good quality produce, agricultural produce, and at the same time conserve the wild part of biodiversity, which most people care about. This is the challenge as well as the objective of an agroecological view on agricultural production. And I think this is what we should all aim to if we really want to save our planet and ensure that we can have a decent livelihood for the years to come. So we have to move forward. We have to move to the concept of general agrobiodiversity to that of functional agrobiodiversity. And you may notice that I'm using the term function and also referring to service. So a question that you may ask yourself is there a real difference between function and services? Well, this is not so clear-cut? Well, it very much depends on the point of view you are referring to. But in an agroecological perspective, so if we really focus on agroecosystems rather than general ecosystems or natural ecosystems, I think that the term functions and services are not that different. But which type of functions or services we need to value? There could be many, and they may change depending on the situation. We may talk about productivity. Productivity in itself is a function of an ecosystem, even a natural ecosystem. You can measure the biomass production in a natural ecosystem, but in an agroecosystem, what we are mainly interested in is the productivity of a subset of species, the crops and livestock. Soil nutrient cycling, as we have seen, is an important supporting service. But soil nutrient cycling also happens in a natural ecosystem, but in an agroecosystem, we are interested in soil nutrient cycling to support the nutrition of our crops. So we want to direct soil nutrient cycling in a specific way. The biological control mechanisms, they occur in nature, but in an agroecosystem, we want to direct these biological control functions towards the control of our crop pests. So we have a specific, more specific objective for this type of service. And then we can have some more general objectives or services like mitigation or adaptation to climate change, the suppression of weeds, and so on. It is important to stress that both production and non-production related services are important for functional agrobiodiversity. It's just ourselves who can decide what to prioritize. And actually, this is our own definition of functional agrobiodiversity. We were not very happy about the very and manifold definitions of functional biodiversity that we could find in the literature. So about 13 years ago, we coined this term. In our view, functional agrobiodiversity is a subset of total biodiversity, which is composed of clusters of elements. We could call them functional groups at any level of biodiversity, the gene level, species level, the habitat level. And what do these elements within a functional group have in common? That they provide the same agroecosystem service. That's not the end of the story, because to be able to talk about a functional agrobiodiversity effect, we need to demonstrate that a higher level of diversity within the functional group is important compared to a lower level of diversity in driving the extent of the service. And this is important in our view because it distinguishes two different concepts and situations. We have biofunctionality on one hand. So biofunctionality is simply a service which is given by the presence of a functional element, or more than one. Whereas, as I just said, functional biodiversity, in the concept of functional biodiversity, the difference is that the extent of the service is very much driven by the diversity within the functional group. So the group of organisms that can convey that type of service. So I give you an example to better explain this concept. If I say that ladybirds predate aphids, it's well known, it's a well-known ecological phenomenon, I'm just referring to biofunctionality. So I'm just saying that these organism, ladybirds, is able to predate aphids, right? But I'm not saying anything about the diversity or the possible importance of diversity in a ladybird community. But if I say that a higher number of ladybird species increases the predation of aphids, I'm also stressing the importance of diversity, higher number of ladybird species within the functional group. And if I can demonstrate that this is true, I'm really highlighting an example of functional biodiversity. So I'm stressing the fact that the diversity within a functional group is able to improve the level of provision of a given service, in this case, biological pest control. And I will just conclude. I'm just having a look at the clock, and okay. So what I propose is that in 5 minutes I will conclude my presentation, and then we can open the debate. But I fear we don't have enough time for the second seminar. But as I already discussed with Uma, we may have later on, maybe in a few months, a second occasion, and I will be more than happy to talk about agroecological with management and dedicate enough time to that topic. So if you agree, I can proceed in this way, because we are already talking about a quite complex subject like agrobiodiversity. So I think it would be nice to dedicate enough time to the discussion with students and other people. So one interesting way, in my opinion, to look at functional agrobiodiversity is to identify those traits within a population, within a plant community, within a habitat that are associated to the provision of a given agroecosystem service. Here you see a list of plant traits. So if you're focusing on plants, we can identify different traits that can confer a plant the ability to express the provision of a service, or to provide actually a service. And these are, for example, leaf area. So it could be smaller or larger. The photosynthetic pathway, you know that we have C3 species, C4 species, and CAM species, so 3 different typologies of plants with different expected efficiency in the amount of photosynthesis. The respiration rate of plants, the nitrogen fixation capacity. Some plants are able to fix atmospheric nitrogen, typically legumes, and others are not. And then other characteristics related to the seed, to the leaf, to the roots, they all together define the trait spectrum of plants and the possibility that those traits have to convey a specific type of ecosystem service. So this, I think, is a nice way of looking at functional agrobiodiversity in the case of plants. Much of our recent research work is focused actually on these. And this type of trait-based approach to the study of functional agrobiodiversity is becoming more and more popular. There are several research groups all over the world which are focusing on this. And this is leading me to the final part of my presentation, and in which I want to propose you our 4-step approach to the study and implementation of functional agrobiodiversity. We have basically developed this approach as a way to help not only scientists, but also practitioners to understand and value and select the part of agrobiodiversity which is more relevant for their own specific case, in such a way that they could best exploit these and gain the most benefit out of the use of agrobiodiversity. A very first important step, the initial step, is to clearly define the context and the objectives, the specific objectives that are can be formulated in a given context. These can be done by researchers on their own, but I think it is more interesting when we engage farmers and other local stakeholders, because we can really amplify the impact of our activity if we engage them from the very beginning. So defining the context means, first of all, in this respect, to set up a team of local actors and stakeholders. And together with them, we can analyze the state of a given context to eventually define the objectives of our project or our study. For example, it could be the improvement of soil health, and this could be done through the diversification of cropping and farming systems in a given area. And to be more specific, this can imply the reduction in the use of external inputs like fertilizers or pesticides. And we could even have the objective of converting a piece of landscape or a series of farms towards organic production. So I'm taking this just as an example to illustrate our four-step approach. Okay, we have defined our objectives. The next step is to define which are the most important agro-ecosystem services for our specific objectives. And better if we do this exercise together with farmers and other local stakeholders. This can be done through focus groups, interviews, or different type of interaction activities together with farmers. And it is important to co-define the target agroecosystem services together with farmers, because if they have to be engaged in this process, they have to be convinced that what they're doing is actually related to their own priorities. So, for example, target agroecosystem services could be the improvement of soil fertility, the reduction of pollution by the use of, for example, excess fertilizers in agriculture, a sustainable management of pests and diseases, and a good amount and good quality of water, which is supply. After defining the target services, we need to define the so-called functional group. As I explained before, this means first and foremost, having a look at what is locally available, what are the type of local resources that we can decline into the three types of agrobiodiversity, genetic, species, and habitat levels that are probably the most important to focus on in order to obtain our objectives and to try to improve the provision of our target services. So, are there any type of local plans or local habitat elements or traditional management techniques that may help us to meet the objectives and improve our target services? It is important to take into account farmers' preferences when doing this part of the job, because as a scientist, we can have in mind some potential solution, but then if we propose these to farmers, sometimes it happens that they are not convinced. And there might be very good reason for this that we may ignore. So getting together, talking to each other is the best way to tune up this composite team towards a common objective. What kind of examples of local resources and associated traits could be relevant, for example, to improve the soil fertility target service? We may have local legume plants that could be used either as a cover crop or intercrops or mulches. We may favor the presence of natural enemies of the target pest that may be as well present in a given area. There might be habitat structures like headlands, hedgerows, woodland, agroforestry systems that might also be quite complex, especially in tropical environments, that we may use to attract natural enemies or to reduce soil erosion or to improve soil nutrient cycling and so on. So you see, I'm just giving this as examples of how you can step-by-step construct a process that eventually leads to an improvement in agricultural management. And finally, the fourth step of this approach is to define the boundaries of the study. What is the spatial scale and the time scale at which we are working? If we are focusing on insects, and most insects fly, as you know, we need to define a spatial scale which is capturing the possibility of insects to fly around and to pollinate if they are pollinators, or exert a biological control effect if they are belonging to this other type of insects. And we need altogether, basically, in this final step, to define what is worthwhile measuring or assessing. So the so-called indicators of performance of innovative agroecological systems based on a higher level of functional agrobiodiversity that can really tell us whether or not our implementation plan is going to be successful. So it's important to also hear the voice of farmers, because they may have in mind some issues that then can become indicators that we as scientists don't have in mind. And again, it's through dialogue that we can really improve the strength of this type of project. So, for example, we may focus at the field, farm, and landscape scale. We focus on both the cropping phase and the fallow phase. And we can have a very long list of indicators, like, for example, visual estimate, on-field measurements on soil and plant status, biological soil health, estimated by the spade test, which is a way by which farmers themselves can self-assess the status of soil health periodically. For example, before and after the introduction of cover crops or other type of diversified practices. We can have indicators related to pests or pollinators and so on. Really, we can have a long list of things that eventually is how we intend to measure and assess whether or not the introduction of diversified measures have been successful. So I think I will stop here. There could be many other things to tell, but I think it's time to leave the room to discussion. So I hand it over back to Sonny to help me arrange the discussion. And thanks a lot for listening to me.
Okay, thank you, professors. It is a very, very wonderful class. Well, I'm finding myself now as your students who are really amazed to your presentations. It really enlightened us the new concepts of functional agrobiodiversity. Well, as an Indonesian, we know that there is some biodiversity as one of the indicator of sustainability, but to add more for the functional, it is something new for us. Well, the ladybug cases is really enlightened us. So what is biofunctional and what is the functional agrobiodiversity? Well, it's now we have to catch a bit of your class. Then I hope that the student will what do you call it? Will digest it into a new understanding on the concept of functional agrobiodiversity. Well, of course, there are a lot of questions, and I see that some question is really not on the conceptual base, but really on the practicals. So they actually know the concepts, but most of them are really asking the practical way or the implementation way of the concept. If I can read some of the questions, I believe we have like 5 questions. It was also very interesting question. Oh, where are my notes? Okay. First question says from Chutnya Namira. How is the agrobiodiversity concept on the plant factories? For example, if we have the plant factories, everything is on screens. Is that still a concept of agrobiodiversity? The second question is from Miske and Johanna is going to the same directions. What happens if there is a case of lacking of agrobiodiversity and goes to extinctions? What happened? So what happened with the farming conditions? The fourth question is from Naomi. The question is, how's the application of functional agrobiodiversity to conventional farming in Indonesia? The fifth is from Hannah. The question is how to arrange the functional agrobiodiversity. How to arrange the functional agrobiodiversity and to make it into the wonderful orchestra. You know, if we let the functional agrobiodiversity, it may lead to negative or positive. So how to manage it into a very nice orchestra? It was a very, I think it's very challenging questions. So I'll leave it all to you to answer all the 5 questions.
Thanks a lot, Sonny, for collecting all these very interesting and very pertinent questions. So yes, it is. I mean, they are all very, very important questions, and I'll try to give an answer. So because what we are actually doing, and the 4-step approach that I explained as last, is actually a way that we have constructed to bridge the gap between, let's say, the theory and practice. And this is why it is important, as I said, to work together with farmers. And okay, how to put functional agrobiodiversity into practice, and if I can give some examples in the condition of Indonesia, yeah, I mean, just to make it better understandable. I think that, okay, as I said, the first important point is to understand what we have available in a given context from the point of view of local resources. This can mean a lot of different things, and it might change the perspective. The perspective might change quite radically if we compare, for example, annual systems. I mean, systems with annual crops with system versus system with perennial crops, like oil palm, for example, in your case, or other type of fruit tree crops. Can you just give me a second? Okay. Sorry, there were too many telephones ringing at the same time in my room.
It's okay.
Okay. Right. So, for example, here, this is one. There are two quite different situations, and then in the context of tropical agriculture, like could be the case of Indonesia, you have the coexistence of small-scale farms versus large plantations, right? Like in the case of oil palm. That's another level that we could address, but even though the solutions or the application of functional biodiversity would probably be different in this different context, there is always the opportunity of, improvement. For example, if we are talking about small-scale farmers, and as far as I know, there's quite a huge number of small-scale farmers in Indonesia. The point is, okay, many of these small-scale farmers, and I have experience in different countries in the world, they tend to they cultivate, for example, some traditional varieties or traditional crops. They use it for various purposes. This is already an important level of agrobiodiversity that should be preserved for the reason that I explained before. Then, of course, we don't have to forget that agriculture is first and foremost an economic activity. So we have to provide either incentives if they do not exist, or we have to provide new markets, for example. I mean, it will be pointless to tell to a farmer, okay, it's important to grow this crop if there is no market for that crop. The market can be created, although, I think that, for example, if we are talking about organic farming, I'm not referring to organic farming as the only solution, but many tropical crops can be interesting for organic farming from the point of view of export, and through, for example, the connection or the creation of networks of small-scale farmers that could enter the chain of the so-called sustainable and equitable food chains, right? So as a way to give enough money to local farmers, so helping them to preserve their local crops, their heritage crops, the culture associated to those crops, and at the same time helping them to create a market which can be local but can also be international. And one of the privilege that you have in tropical agriculture is that you have the right environmental conditions in principle to grow a lot of crops, right? So creating these opportunities could be a way to promote and conserve biodiversity. From a more practical point of view, from a point of view of management, there are some traditional practices. For example, think about intercropping. Intercropping is has been practiced for many years by farmers, and the point is to make them understand how they can best combine the different crops in an intercropping situation in order to reap the most in terms of services. So sometimes intercropping systems are more or less occasional, right? So you put a legume side by side with a cereal crop, but there are ways to optimize the benefits that you can get out of this combination by choosing, for example, more appropriate varieties, or by combining these two crops in a better way. So in order to have some more specific benefits, because this type of combination can improve the control of some pests, or they can improve the cycling of nutrients and contribute to increasing the accumulation of soil organic matter in the soil. So there are many ways. The specific solution might be sought locally, right? So what I can give as a general message is that it is important to reassess what is available locally in order to have this as a building block towards improve diversified systems. In a completely opposite direction, in the context of plantations, for example, I know, not in Indonesia, but I have had some experience in other tropical plantations, like coffee plantations in Costa Rica, for example, in which they are trying to introduce cover crops as a way to diminish the detrimental effect of soil erosion that in an area in which precipitation, and this is probably like the case of many Indonesian regions, is quite high. So they can, if you cultivate the soil too much, then you can have a very strong negative impacts on soil erosion. And cover crops are a first and rather simple way to try to implement a measure, which is an element of functional biodiversity, which can have multiple objectives. So through keeping the soil covered in between the tree lines of a plantation, right, all year round, you can somehow improve the soil fertility or soil health through the reduction of soil erosion. You can have also other type of benefits depending on which type of species you are utilizing as a cover crop. You can suppress weeds. You can regulate agricultural pests and diseases, because some of these species can release some substances that are detrimental to insect pests, for example. So these are just examples of how you can put these bits and things together into coherent and innovative systems. I cannot give specific recipes because they very much depend on the context, but just to give you a general idea of how you can construct this type of approach. I hope this somehow answered this set of questions.
sure, professors. Should be like that. Should we have more time to discuss, and also should we have more communications to be made to giving more understanding on this concept. Well, we still have times to one or two discussions, and one more question from students. From Saka Putra Nurrahman, he's asking to be more on how is we place the plant protection in this new approach, because of traditionally we have the agronomy, we have, if there is a pest and disease, we just spray, and where you put this chemicals or plant protection approach on this new concept of functional agrobiodiversity.
Okay, this is a very interesting and important question. Through functional biodiversity, or in general through agroecological approaches, we shift the focus from curative to preventive methods. This is the main difference. And what kind of solutions we can have in terms of preventive methods. The first important point, again, is to start from the selection of the right genetic material, focusing on, for example, resistance or tolerance to pests and diseases. We can explore the varieties or the germplasm that we have available, and we can find out material or germplasm that has quite a strong potential to reduce pests and diseases preventively in this way. So, as a matter of fact, what we can do is either retrieve this type of cultivars and use them directly, but we can also use them in breeding programs. So if they have the right type of traits for resistance or tolerance, we can incorporate these new traits to develop new cultivars that are better tolerant or resistant. So that's an important point, because if we can reduce the pressure from pests and pathogens, we are already at a good point. And obviously, we will need less use of insecticides or fungicides just because of this. But that's the only one part of the story. So this is an example of how we can address the problem from a genetic agrobiodiversity perspective. Then we can move on to the species agrobiodiversity perspective. And this can mean, for example, if we are talking about annual crops, improving the crop rotation in order to diversify it and include some crops that are less susceptible to a given disease. If the disease or pest is a polyphagous disease, then it's a little bit more difficult. But if it's a specialized pest or disease, through an appropriate crop rotation, or through intercropping, or through the use of cover crops, all these are examples of agrobiodiversity at the species level, we can further contribute to improving the situation. But then we have the habitat. And the habitat can also be arranged in such a way to, for example, promote the higher presence of natural enemies of the crop pest through the combination of hedgerows, field margins, other shrubs or trees or other habitat structures that we know can contribute in this way. And there is one, talking about pest control or agroecological pest control, there is one set of measures, or I would say an approach, which is quite interesting, making full use of agrobiodiversity, and that you probably know is called push-pull strategies. Push-pull strategies basically are ways in which we can utilize mainly plants in such a way to, at the same time, to attract or repel insect pests. So we can attract insect pests in the surroundings of a cultivated field, in a cover crop, for example, if the cover crop is composed of a plant species or a group of plant species, a mixture of plant species which are attracting pests. This might seem foolish. Why should I need to attract a pest closer to the field? Because then a cover crop is destroyed And by destroying the cover crop or incorporating it in the soil, at the same time, you can destroy the pest, which then have less opportunity to get into the field where there is our crop that we want to protect. And through the use of other plants, so biodiversity at the species level, that are able to produce volatile compounds that repel some pests. And there is an increasing body of literature focused on this type of solutions. We can at the same time drive the pest away from our crops by just introducing these companion plants that have the purpose of producing these volatile compounds, pushing the pest away from the crop. These are set of solutions which are quite interesting, and there are a lot of success stories in mainly tropical environments that this can actually be implemented with good success. So just as a general example of how we can approach a new way of controlling pests and diseases through the use of functional agrobiodiversity.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very interesting concepts and very different approach than the common approach. Well, maybe we still have a question from the lecturer, professors, lecturers. Do you have any question? You can go and shout to Professor Paulo Barberi. Still any questions? Floor, please, professors. If not, I have one, professors.
Please shoot.
I've been waiting for giving you questions. Well, the biodiversity concepts we already apply or understand about these concepts. In some case, we counting the number of species, we counting the distributions, abundance, domination, biodiversity index, but we haven't reached to functional. How to quantify the functional is, for me, is a bit challenging, and you enlighten us with the case of ladybug. It's very interesting. I think I have to study more. But what our approach here in Brawijaya is we usually finding the key indicators. For example, we check for the fireflies or the orthoptera insects or water striders, anything to give the proven that this agro ecosystem is still functional or still healthy, something like that. So
yes. So as a matter of fact, as I understand, you're already doing assessments on the functionality of agro ecosystems. I think what I was referring to as fourth step of my proposed approach, so the choice of the list of indicators is a very relevant one. So depending on the crop, depending on the cropping system, depending on the target service, this list of indicators can change a bit, right? Obviously, if we are focusing on, let's say, general indicators of agroecosystem health, we also have to keep in mind that, for example, there are some gills or some species of insects that are quite good indicators of this. I mean, I'm sure you know them. Like, for example, the carabids, right? Coleoptera are a group of insects that actually can be considered to be indicators of several services, because depending on the species, some of them can control pests, so can be actually agents for pest control, but others are important as detritivorous, so they can contribute to recycling of organic matter to production of humus. So if the focus of a study is multiple, so if you're not just focusing on pest control, but you're interested in measuring several indicators of functionality, I think this could be an interesting group of bioindicators to focus on. But then also plants. I mean, plants can also be indicators of a lot of different things. Wild plants are very good indicators, for example, of soil health conditions. They can reveal the presence or lack of nutrients in the soil, nitrogen, for example. There are some plants which are nitrogen scavengers and others which are more present in nutrient lacking soils. And also the plants themselves can be hosts of insects, either pests or beneficials. And in this way, we can interpret the abundance and diversity of plants as potential providers of ecosystem services. We don't have to forget that, as everybody knows, but I didn't mention it today, but it's important to keep this in mind, that not all biodiversity is useful for agriculture. I mean, weeds, pests, and diseases are also part of biodiversity, but of course, it's not the type of biodiversity that we want to encourage. So we can still monitor and measure this part of biodiversity from the lenses of ecosystem services. In this case, we will refer to what we call ecosystem disservices. So the negative contribution that is some species or some elements of biodiversity can exert to an agro-ecosystem. So I think we have first to compose the boundaries of the picture. So to decide what we want to measure, so what type of services we want to address, knowing that it will basically be impossible to measure everything because biodiversity is just too complex. But this is exactly why if we decide which functional elements we want to focus on, we can improve very much the efficacy of a general, let's say, monitoring study on agricultural biodiversity. We don't lose time in measuring or counting every single species of insect. This might be interesting from a taxonomic point of view, but it would be a tremendous effort, and in the end, it might not be rewarding in terms of, you know, focusing specifically on some issues which are relevant to biodiversity. But in principle, you mentioned some of the classical indicators or indices of biodiversity. I mean, the Shannon index, different type of equitability or diversity or dominance index can also be applied to a functional biodiversity study. The difference is that you're not calculating those indices on the overall biodiversity of plants or insects or microorganisms or whatsoever, but you're just focusing on a subset of organisms, which are those that can convey the services or the disservices. There's nothing wrong in adapting the classical ecological indicators of biodiversity to a functional use. Then there are some specific indicators which have been developed for a specific view on functionality, but in general, I'm also doing this. I'm applying or adapting some of the general indicators for extracting a more functional view on biodiversity. But I think this could be, these discussions, Sonny, could take weeks, because really, if we enter into, you know, the methodological side, which is very interesting and still open, it would be probably worthwhile to organize a workshop or anything like that, which could be an idea. Yes. Okay. But I'm afraid that I cannot answer to these exhaustively in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think the time is not enough for just 2 hours discussion, professors. So anyway, generally we are all having fun doing this class. All professors, students are very, very enjoying your class, and they actually, if I'm not giving restrictions, they still want to answer. They still want to ask a lot of questions. So I think we can arrange more time like this to the committee. Please consider to have another class with Professor Paulo Barbieri. Well, I think we can conclude this meeting or this class from Professor Paulo Barberi. Please give a round of applause for Professor Barberi. Very, very nice class. And I believe that it will enlighten us to do more research on functional agrobiodiversity.
Well, as you said, Sonny, it is true that this is such a complex element and topic that it needs some digestion from the students. But the digestion, you know, the best digestion is the longest the digestion, the better it is. So if in the course of time, you have other curiosities or questions or anything or any type of interaction that you would like to have with myself, I'll be happy. So we can find out another occasion.
Thank you very much, professors.
Thanks to you.
Okay. Another round of applause for Professor Barberi. So professors and students, I believe this is the end of my job of hosting these discussions and lectures, and I give all the times back to the master of ceremony. So time is yours.
Okay.
Thank you, Sonny. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kurniawan Putri Caksono, SPMP PhD. And also thank you to the speaker for the amazing discussion. And I would like to say thank you to the participants who still joined this meeting until now. And now we are already near the end of our meeting today. And it also means that we have completed our 3-in-1 program this semester. So please join me to invite the head of the Department of Agronomy to deliver a special closing remarks. Dr. Nurahmi Arjerini, SPMSI, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, the Master of Ceremony, Honorable Head of Environmental Resources Laboratory, Department of Agronomy, Dr. Sitawati, Honorable the Coordinator of the Teknologi Production course, Professor Agus Suryanto, and Honorable Professor Barberi as the speaker from the Institute of Life Science, Italy, Dr. Sonny, and dear colleagues and the students. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, as the participants at the 3-in-1 guest lecture of the Teknologi Production course 4 series, I'm pleased to speak to you at the closing of the event. I believe that productive progress has been made. This guest lecture is an excellent example of successful cooperation. I'm grateful to all of you for being part of this effort. Thank you for all the speakers, moderators, participants, and the committee that progressing this important event to a successful conclusion. Thank you for taking part and contributing to this success. We'd say Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. I now declare this event officially closed. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you so much for the closing remarks, Dr. Nurahmi. And finally, we come at the end of this meeting. And students, don't forget you still have your own class next week. And once again, thank you everyone for participating in this program. Stay healthy and always be happy. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Sir Paulo.
Bye-bye. Thanks to you.
Sir Paulo. Thank you very much.
See you soon.
Thank you very much, Professor Barberi, Dr. Sonny.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Dr.
Thank you.
Sonny.
Okay.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.